So today I want to talk about something that I think almost everyone is getting wrong. And when I say almost everyone, I do not mean ordinary people busy living their lives. I mean the analysts, the commentators, the politicians, and the financial markets themselves. Everyone is looking at the ceasefire between the United States and Iran and drawing the same conclusion. The war is over. Tensions are easing. The global economy can begin to recover. Energy prices will stabilize. The world can return to something resembling normal. And I want to tell you clearly and directly why that conclusion is not just premature, but fundamentally mistaken. This ceasefire is not peace. It is a political maneuver. It is the gap between rounds. And what comes in the next round will be more consequential for the global economy, for energy markets, for American power, and for ordinary people's lives than anything that happened in the military phase that just concluded. Let me explain why I say this with such confidence. And let me do it not by speculating about military strategy or diplomatic intentions, but by looking at the economic and structural realities that made this conflict inevitable in the first place, and that have not changed 1 millimeter because two governments agreed to stop shooting at each other temporarily. The first thing you need to understand is what a ceasefire actually is in economic terms. A ceasefire is not a resolution. It is a pause. It is what happens when both sides need time. Time to rearm, time to reassess, time to reposition economically and diplomatically, time to secure new alliances and new supply chains, time to prepare for the next phase of a competition that did not start with this military exchange and will not end with this agreement. Every major ceasefire in modern history has been followed by a resumption of conflict, either in the same form or in a different form. The Korean War armistice of 1953 did not end the Korean conflict. It froze it, with American troops still stationed on the peninsula 7 decades later. The Oslo Accords of 1993 did not resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They paused it while both sides repositioned. The Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 did not end the conflict in eastern Ukraine. They deferred it for 8 years until February 2022, when it resumed in a far more destructive form. Ceasefires do not end conflicts, they transform them. And the transformation is almost always toward greater economic and structural disruption, not less. So what does this specific ceasefire transform? What are the economic realities that persist through it and beyond it? Let me walk you through them systematically, because this is where the analysis that most people are missing actually lives. The first structural reality is the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important choke point in the global energy system. Approximately 20% of all global oil trade passes through this narrow waterway every single day. Every barrel of Saudi oil going to Asia, every barrel of UAE oil going to Europe, every barrel of Qatari LNG going to Japan and South Korea. All of it flows through a strait that is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and that Iran has the geographic, military, and technical capability to disrupt at any time it chooses. The ceasefire does not change Iran's capability to disrupt the strait. It does not change Iran's willingness to use that capability as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. It does not change the fundamental geography that makes the strait so vulnerable. What the ceasefire changes is the immediate threat level, not the structural vulnerability. Every nation that depends on Gulf energy, and that includes Japan, China, South Korea, India, Germany, and most of the rest of the industrial world, now knows with absolute certainty that this vulnerability is real and exploitable. That knowledge will drive energy policy, military investment, and supply chain decisions for decades, regardless of what any ceasefire agreement says. And if you are finding this analysis useful, please subscribe. I cover the economic reality beneath the geopolitical surface every week, because this gap between what is reported and what is actually happening is where the decisions that affect your life are being made. The second structural reality is Chinese vulnerability, and this is perhaps the most important and most underreported aspect of this entire conflict. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy needs from the Gulf Cooperation Council. 40%. For the world's second largest economy, the economy that manufactures approximately 28% of global manufactured output, the economy that employs hundreds of millions of industrial workers whose livelihoods depend on factory production, 40% of the energy that powers all of that comes through the Strait of Hormuz, through the exact waterway that just demonstrated its vulnerability to disruption in the most public and undeniable way possible. China watched this conflict with the kind of attention that only an existentially threatened party watches an unfolding crisis. And what China observed was that the energy supply chain its entire economic model depends on can be disrupted by a conflict it had no role in starting and no ability to stop. This is not an abstraction for China's leadership. This is a structural crisis that will accelerate China's already urgent drive to secure alternative energy sources, to build strategic reserves large enough to withstand months of supply disruption, to develop overland pipeline routes from Russia and Central Asia that bypass the strait entirely, and to project naval and diplomatic power into the Indian Ocean and the Gulf region in ways that will bring China into direct strategic competition with the United States across a much broader geographic theater than the current conflict involved. And here is why this matters for the global economy in ways that extend far beyond China's borders. When China feels existentially threatened by energy supply vulnerability, China acts. It does not wait. It does not deliberate. It invests massively and rapidly in securing what it needs. That investment takes the form of accelerated renewable energy build-out, of long-term commodity purchasing agreements with resource-rich nations that lock in supply at the expense of other buyers, of Belt and Road infrastructure projects that create transportation and energy corridors, giving China supply route alternatives, and of military modernization focused specifically on the ability to keep sea lanes open or alternatively to threaten the sea lanes of rivals. Every one of these responses creates new pressures on the global economy, new competition for resources, new friction in trade relationships, and new instability in the financial systems that connect the world's major economies. The third structural reality is American credibility and the cost of maintaining it. America spent approximately $12 billion and lost 13 soldiers in the military phase of this conflict. The Strait of Hormuz remains vulnerable. Iran's nuclear program remains intact or close to intact. Iran's regional influence network in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria remains functional. The military operation achieved tactical objectives but did not fundamentally alter the strategic landscape that created the conflict. Every nation watching this drew conclusions about the cost and limits of American military power that will shape their behavior going forward. American allies in the Gulf who were already questioning whether the American security guarantee was reliable enough to stake their economic futures on, those questions became more urgent, not less. The ceasefire does not restore American credibility. It provides a temporary pause during which American credibility will be debated and reassessed in every capital from Riyadh to Tokyo. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. The analysis I am building here connects directly to the economic decisions you and your country will face in the months and years ahead. The fourth structural reality is the petrodollar system and what this conflict has done to it. The petrodollar system, the arrangement established in 1974, whereby Gulf oil is priced and traded in US dollars, giving the dollar its unique global reserve status, rests on one foundation above all others: the Gulf states' confidence that America can and will protect them and the sea lanes through which their oil flows. This conflict has shaken that confidence in ways that will accelerate the already advanced process of Gulf states diversifying away from dollar dependency. Saudi Arabia's ongoing conversations with China about yuan-denominated oil pricing did not stop during this conflict. They continued. The UAE's participation in the mBridge digital currency settlement system did not pause. It continued. The structural erosion of the petrodollar system, which I have discussed in detail in previous analyses, did not reverse because of this ceasefire. It accelerated. Because the conflict demonstrated simultaneously that American military protection is costly, limited in its ability to achieve decisive outcomes, and increasingly politically contested within America itself, and that the Gulf energy infrastructure is vulnerable in ways that make dollar-denominated pricing arrangements look increasingly like a geopolitical liability rather than a source of stability and security. The Gulf states are rational actors. They watch this conflict carefully. And rational actors do not bet their entire economic future on a single security arrangement when that arrangement has just demonstrated its limitations in the most visible way possible. They diversify. Quietly and gradually, they reduce exposure to any single security arrangement. The fifth structural reality is what I call the new phase of the competition. The military exchange that just concluded was expensive, visible, and dramatic. What comes next will be less visible, but more economically consequential. It will take place in the domain of energy infrastructure investment, in the domain of alternative payment systems, in the domain of diplomatic realignment across the global south, in the domain of technology competition between American and Chinese industrial systems, and in the domain of financial architecture as nations accelerate their moves away from dollar dependency. These are not dramatic military events that make headlines. They are slow structural shifts that accumulate over years and decades into transformations that permanently alter which nations are powerful and which are not. The world you are living in right now is not a world returning to normal after a temporary disruption. It is a world in which a temporary pause in military activity is being used by every major actor to reposition for the next phase of a competition that is fundamentally economic, not military in its deepest nature. The competition over who controls energy, who controls supply chains, who controls the financial architecture that determines which currencies are trusted and which are not, who controls the technology that will power the next generation of industrial production. These competitions did not pause when the guns went quiet. They accelerated because in the silence after a ceasefire, when the world's attention briefly relaxes and financial markets rally on relief, that is precisely when the structural moves that matter most get made. Saudi Arabia will use this period to deepen its relationships with China, India, and the BRICS bloc while maintaining its formal American alliance. China will use this period to accelerate its energy security investments and its alternative payment system development. Iran will use this period to reconstitute its damaged infrastructure, to deepen its relationships with Russia and China, and to recalibrate its nuclear program in ways that will create the next crisis. America will use this period to debate internally between a political establishment that wants to maintain global commitments and a growing domestic constituency that wants to withdraw from expensive foreign entanglements, exactly how much of its resources and credibility it is willing to spend maintaining a global order that is becoming increasingly difficult and expensive to sustain. These are the real negotiations happening during the ceasefire, not at the diplomatic table, in the boardrooms, the finance ministries, the energy ministries, and the military planning rooms of every major power on Earth. Subscribe for more analysis of these structural, economic, and geopolitical developments explained clearly and plainly. And tell me in the comments, do you think this ceasefire will hold for long, or are we simply in the gap between rounds? See you next time.